Rabbi Laura Jonathan Sacks believed profoundly in the power of the written word and authored many books and articles that addressed major trends and issues of the day through the lens of Jewish values and Jewish texts. In an effort to honor his creative contributions, Yeshiva University created the Sacks Book Prize to broaden the impact of Jewish scholarship in the arena of contemporary Jewish thought. The prize aims to recognize recent publications of ideas deeply sourced in Jewish texts with wide appeal within and beyond the Jewish community. I'm Dr. Shira Weiss of the Sacks-Herenstein Center of Values and Leadership, and I'm pleased to present my conversations on the Sacks Book Prize podcast. We're thrilled to announce the winner of the 2025 Rabbi Sacks Book Prize is Beyond Dispute, Rediscovering the Jewish Art of Constructive Disagreement by Daniel Taub, published by Hotter Faith. Daniel is a diplomat and international lawyer who has represented Israel in peace negotiations with its neighbors and as ambassador to the UK. He lectures widely about conflict resolution in foreign ministries and universities. Daniel is an accredited mediator and runs difficult conversation laboratories, bringing together participants from different ideological backgrounds. He's written drama for Israeli television and theater and for the London stage. A popular lecturer on biblical texts, he's the author of Parasha Diplomatit, a collection of diplomatic insights on the Bible. Congratulations, Daniel.
Thank you so much. What a pleasure to be with you.
Rabbi Sacks, the namesake of this book prize, had a profound influence on you, and you cite him in your book. Can you describe an anecdote that illustrates your relationship and how his thought leadership impacted your thinking about the topic of constructive disagreement?
Of course. Probably one of the biggest perks that I had during my time being posted in London was the tradition that the Israeli ambassador sits on a regular basis with the chief rabbi of the United Kingdom to trade notes on what's happening in the region or what's happening in the Jewish community and so on. And so I got the chance to sit regularly with Rabbi Sacks. But I realized that this was an opportunity not to be wasted. So I suggested to him, if I prepare some notes, can we, get the work out of the way very quickly at the beginning of the conversation and spend the rest of the time studying? And he, of course, was very open to that. So we tried to have a kind of chavruta, and the honest truth is it wasn't enormously successful. There was a significant gap, as you can imagine. So when I saw that wasn't working, I said, look, we've tried the Yeshiva model. Perhaps it isn't right for us. Let's try the Cambridge model, the tutorial model. So let me send you in advance of our meeting some of the big questions that I think, we should be thinking about. And maybe you can just choose any one of them and just speak about it. And that's what happened. And that, as you can imagine, it was marvelous. I was very, very moved recently when the curator of the Rabbi Sacks collection at the National Library of Israel said, I want to show you something. And there, amongst all of his correspondence with Prince Charles and the prime ministers and so on and so forth, was a page of notes that he'd made ahead of our conversation on some of these questions, which I had never imagined he'd done. So that was extremely moving. The subject of my book, which relates to the toxicity of public debate today and how we can have better conversations, was something that was of great concern to Rabbi Sacks. Particularly, he focuses on his last book, Morality, but it's throughout many of his books. So it's not a surprise that I quote him regularly in the book, and I think you'll see his influence even on the pages where he's not specifically quoted.
What were some of the topics that he chose from your questions to discuss
Oh,
with
my
you?
goodness. Well, at the time, we were very much concerned about the rise of fundamentalism and whether ways, this was about the time that he was publishing or writing, not in God's name. So that was one of the things. He was surprisingly interested and well informed in Eastern traditions. So that was one of the other areas that we discussed. And so, it was, as you can imagine with Rabbi Sacks, it was very far ranging. And of course, a very, very deep concern for Israel. These were the questions that he would usually raise. He was very concerned about what he saw happening in Israeli society. He was very concerned about the reputation of Israel in the West. And he was very concerned, actually, that his own teaching should find a platform in Israel. And one of the things that's been so moving is to see the interest in Rabbi Sacks that has been generated. We're coming up to 5 years, in the 5 years since his passing.
Where did the idea of this book come from? What motivated you to write it?
So it actually came from a somewhat unusual space. before October the 7th, sometimes we forget that Israel was about as divided a society as it has been in its history. And I got a glimmer of hope from an unusual corner. I volunteer as a mediator in a community mediation center, and I was mediating a dispute between two Arab residents of Jerusalem. And it was getting very heated. It looked like it was going to get out of control. And then my co-mediator, who is an Arab sheikh, said to me, "Do you mind if I depart from the mediation protocol?" I said, "No, we have nothing to lose." And so he stopped speaking in Hebrew. He started speaking in Arabic. But more to the point, he stopped speaking as a mediator and he started speaking as an imam, as a religious leader. And he was channeling a kind of Muslim tradition of sulha, of reconciliation. And the change in the environment of the room was absolutely remarkable. And that got me to thinking, well, what tools do we have in our tradition that might do that? Are there ways in which those tribal traditions that we tend to think can only drive us apart might actually bring us together? And when I started revisiting the rabbinic approach to argument that developed 2,000 years ago, I was very struck by how many similarities it bears to modern thinking in social psychology and conflict management. And it took me a while to realize why I think that is. And I think it is, in a sense, because that approach to argument 2,000 years ago arose against the background of a social crisis, around the time of the destruction of the temple, the exile, but a social crisis that manifested itself in lack of trust in information, lack of trust in authority, in echo chambers and tribalization, basically in a social crisis that's very similar to the social crisis that many Western societies are facing today. So that's why I thought it would be interesting to revisit the practice, the principles and the practices that have actually helped the Jewish people survive and flourish through welcoming argument in.
How has your conflict management and negotiation experience, as well as the rabbinic tradition that you're so familiar with, how has it influenced how you navigate or how one should navigate interpersonal disagreements?
I've spent many years in the negotiating room, and if I try and distill, the main lessons that I've learned, I suppose one of them is this. If you read any book on large-scale negotiations, international negotiations, they will tell you that each large-scale negotiation is really three negotiations in one. There's the negotiation between you and me, what's sometimes called the negotiation across the table. But on each side of the table, there are different interests represented. I may be from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. I want to know what this is going to do to our foreign relations. My neighbor is from the Ministry of Defense. He wants to know about the security balance. On the other side of me, the Ministry of Finance wants to know what it's going to do to our budget. So we have a little tug of war, and that's called the negotiation along the table. And then at a certain stage, if we make progress, we have to sell this deal to the people that sent us. And that's called the negotiation behind the table. So those are the three classic dynamics: across the table, along the table, behind the table. And I suppose my main takeaway from years in the negotiating room is that there's a fourth dynamic. And that dynamic is a dynamic that takes place within each of the negotiators. And it's a negotiation between the past and the future, between the voices of the grandparents and the voices of the grandchildren. And the role of the negotiators is to try to make the voices of the children of the future at least as compelling as those voices that are trying to draw us back into the past. And I think when we find ourselves in a difficult interpersonal conversation or argument, keeping our eyes focused on this future aspiration, on this value that we share, can possibly be a helpful compass in trying to navigate those differences.
How can one find sometimes that value that you share?
So it's not always easy. It's not always easy. There's a tool actually that I find helpful from social psychology that's called the ladder of inference, which I think is very Talmudic. And basically it suggests that when we have an argument between us, we should think of the argument as a ladder. And the feet of the ladder, it's a bit like Jacob, but the feet of the ladder are grounded in the facts. And as we move up the ladder, we have our values and our interpretations. And then as we get to the top of the ladder, we get to our conclusions. And what I find is a really helpful exercise, and a lot of Talmudic questions are geared in a way to doing this, is to ask ourselves, which rung of the ladder are we on at any particular point in the argument? Because, if we disagree about the facts, that will lead to one type of conversation. If we disagree about practical conclusions, that will be a very different kind of conversation. And one of the things that is so helpful about this model of the ladder is even if we have a very painful disagreement on one rung, it's a reminder that there may be other rungs where we actually have points of common interest.
I was reading once a book by a divorce mediator, and he was saying that when a divorcing couple comes in and sits at opposite sides of the table, it's a much worse sign for him than if they sit on the same side of the table, recognizing that despite their animosity towards each other, they have a common goal.
I think that's important. I think that's a critically important point, and not just within families. When I was at the Kennedy School in Harvard, I became friendly with a guy called Jamal Murad, who used to be the president of Ecuador. And he had actually reached a peace agreement with neighboring Peru. And he said the first time before he went into the negotiations, he called up Roger Fisher, who was a great professor of negotiation theory, and asked, what should I try to achieve in my first meeting with Prime Minister Fujimori of Peru? And Roger Fisher said to him, only one thing, a picture that will appear in the newspapers of the two of you not sitting across the table, but sitting on the same side, looking at a map together, to send the message that you are part of a collaborative exercise. And he showed me the picture that appeared in the papers, precisely that, of the two of them sitting on the same side. I was interested to read in a book by Van Jones, the Democratic commentator, that when he was a young man, he had a very deep friendship with Newt Gingrich, which was a surprising pairing. And he said he learned from Newt Gingrich, who told him, your 90% enemy can still be your 10% friend. And, whether we're in a divorce or an international negotiation or American Congress, that's probably an important thing to hold fast to.
What advice do you give people who are having difficult conversations, either within their workplace, within their organizations, within their families? There's so many divisive issues within the world today, certainly amidst families, organizations, about Israel in particular. What guidance do you give people to navigate these types of difficult conversations?
So I think you're right, particularly this past 2 years. It's become, the issue of Israel has become an acute fault line within many Jewish organizations, within many families, intergenerationally, and so on. And the truth is, I hesitate before I give prescriptive advice, because every organization is different. And certainly when you come to families, not only are they different, but often when we have difficult conversations, the thing that is really hurting us isn't necessarily the thing that we say we're discussing. So you really need to be careful. But there are a number of very general suggestions that I can make. First of all, whether it is an organization or a family, I think as far as possible, taking the conversation offline and not having it publicly is a helpful thing to do. Let's not have this discussion at the AGM. Let's not have it at the Seder table or in our extended family group. But let's try and choose the environment where the reputational costs of moderating our opinion are as low as we can make them. But then more specifically, within organizations, when I've met with Jewish organizations, one of the things I've been struck by is how there is a tendency to view these questions in binary form. Is that person in or out? Do we sign on this petition or not sign on this petition? And I think that does a disservice to the organizations and to the issues, because usually they're not binary. If you think about a guest speaker, it's not a question of whether they're in or out. There may well be people who you wouldn't invite to speak from your pulpit, but you might decide that their article is worthy of being included in a workbook for a discussion group. So I think the idea is to see whether we can use the full range of tools at our disposal. Within families, one of the suggestions that I make is not to start with talking points, but to start with stories, to start telling the story of what has shaped your opinion. And again, this is very Talmudic, where halakha is so embedded with Agadah, narrative and law and so on. And I can imagine a situation in which a younger member of a family might hear from an older member for the first time what it was like to grow up in a house where there was always a packed suitcase under one of the beds, and an older member of the family might learn for the first time what it's like to share a college dorm with somebody who every night is on the phone home to their family in Lebanon or Gaza to find out what's happened. And I think in these kind of family discussions, before we try to change people's minds, it might be easier and more productive to start thinking about how we could open people's hearts a little bit.
I want to follow up with what you just said about binaries and also the stories that shape people's or inform people's identity or opinions. You encourage your readers in the book to re-examine their own convictions and the roles that identities and loyalties play in shaping our opinions. And you also encourage readers to seek out the very best expression of opposing views. But how do we get people to do this? Many people prefer to remain in their echo chambers and only seek information from certain news channels or engage in conversation with people they know they already agree with. So how do you encourage this type of self-assessment and opening your view up to alternative perspectives?
I really appreciate the question, Shira, because I think the first stage is to recognize how difficult it is. You know, in a strange way, we all of us have this tendency to assume that we are born ready for the most difficult conversation, and recognizing that we need to be prepared for it and ripe for it is a part of it. I actually think that the Jewish tradition contains a number of practices that are very helpful. You know, one of them, for example, if you ask a kid who has been studying Talmud to tell you what they have studied today, they will recite what is generally called the shaklavataria, the to and fro of the debate. And they will say, this person says this person says this person brings this argument, this person brings that argument. And they will have in some way welcomed into themselves the entirety of the debate. If you were to ask the CEO of a Fortune 500 company what happened in their last board meeting, he will tell you the bottom line. And all of those opinions will get left by the wayside. So I think there are certain types of practice that broaden our receptiveness. I think another one, there are many, but another one that I think is very powerful, and the rabbis put a big emphasis on it, and that is citing our own influences, citing the sources that have shaped us. They actually say that this is a tool to bring redemption, which is really sort of high blown phrase from the rabbis. And I think what it says is, you know, if we adopt a position that the truth is not within us, but it can't be reached without us, then part of our job is to try and clear the channels of communication so we can be a greater servant in the service of truth. And as you say, we're all of us the results of our echo chambers. So we can't remove that entirely. But at least being open about those voices that we've brought into the room with us, raising the curtain on them and saying, look, this is where my information comes from, you know, and being open to recognizing that there may be data points that I haven't fully taken into consideration is a way of respecting our counterpart and trying to build something a little greater together.
But are there confines to that openness? Meaning, does being open to new and different ideas mean that you need to listen to every opinion? How can you decide what falls outside of the bounds of legitimate discussion?
I think that's a critical point. There was an American professor who advised his students, you know, you don't want to be so open-minded that your brains fall out. And I think that's absolutely true. And in the book, I describe that in line with the rabbi's comment that there are 70 facets, 70 faces to the Torah. And that, of course, doesn't mean that there isn't a 71st face or a 72nd face that is not legitimate like the others. So how do we decide what should come within the 10th? And there are a number of approaches, but one of them that I find interesting, because it seemed to me very clear when I went through the Talmud, there were a number of cases, not so many, but there are a number of cases where rabbis are thrown out of the Bet Midrash, out of the house of study. And what was interesting to me was that in almost every case, the reason why somebody was thrown out was not because of the content of their position, but because they didn't buy into the process of debate. And what that suggests to me at our root, this is a question of process rather than content. And it suggests to me that we should challenge ourselves to hear positions, you know, maybe in relation to climate change or vaccination that are uncomfortable for us, until the person we're speaking to says, there is no amount of evidence that you could bring that would make me change my mind. Because then we're not really in a conversation. There's a saying amongst diplomats, you can change my opinion, but you can't change my instructions. So if we're talking to somebody who effectively has a set of instructions, if not from their government, but from their tribe or their social circle, then we are probably best served by cutting the conversation short and investing our energies elsewhere.
You facilitate difficult conversations laboratories. I mentioned it in the intro, and you mentioned it a number of times with regard to different strategies that you employ throughout the book. Can you describe these laboratories and how they've enhanced civil discourse?
So really, you should speak to the participants in the laboratories to find out. But I personally have found them incredibly moving. And actually, I've been deeply impressed by, I don't think it's an exaggeration to use the word courage of the people that have participated. Because at the end of the day, it really does require courage, to leave the space that you described before, the comfort of those zones that reinforce our own identities and so on. And the process, it turns out, is quite a long process. I haven't, maybe other people have, found any shortcuts to creating that trusting environment that allows people to explore the space between their identity and their position, which is the most interesting space. If you ask somebody, okay, that's your position, can you give me a percentage how much you actually believe in it? And the truth is, it's not always 100%. Often we will go through experiences and we will have a stronger belief in our position or less. And that space where we are able to say, look, this is my position. I certainly agree with it, but here's where I have doubts about it. And I disagree with your position, but here is where I find it impressive, or here's where I find it challenging. And I don't think in the course of leading difficult conversations laboratories, I have witnessed many people who have done 180-degree turns or anything like that. But I also don't think there has been a participant that has left without their views becoming moderated or nuanced to some degree and seeing things in a way that was a little bit different from the way they walked in.
Interesting. My own research is on philosophy, specifically narrative ethics in the Bible. And I appreciate the instructive power of story. And you spent a lot of time in your book as you write about how in diplomacy, power of stories can reach where other forms of expression like facts or statistics cannot. And it opens up emotional dimensions that others can identify with, even if political positions remain disparate. Can you recount from your experience an instance in which the power of story was particularly effective?
Certainly, first of all, just to say that, your area of research is fascinating to me, and I'd love to have the opportunity to learn more. I'm particularly interested in the way in which sometimes the narrative of the Bible sort of acts as a critical commentary on the law of the Bible. So, the law of the Bible, for example, will say that the oldest son should take hold of the leadership, or that you can have more than one wife. But if you look at the narrative of the Bible, the leadership almost always comes from the second or youngest son. And there is not a single case in which a man has more than one wife, and there are many. And that's a recipe for a happy home. So you have this fascinating dialogue between the narrative and the plain law, which I think is interesting. If I think about how it plays out in negotiations, in the negotiating room, I don't think I was alone. I was pretty prepared for any talking point that the other side could bring up. I had my list of facts, I had my list of legal references and so on. What I think I was less prepared for was the power of personal stories. When people would share, exactly, what the current situation meant to them. I had, after I left the negotiations, I worked for a philanthropic foundation, and I was, an Arab resident of East Jerusalem gave me a book that he had written about what it was like, a novel, about a personal autobiographical novel about what it was like to grow up in East Jerusalem. And these are places that are just a couple of kilometers from where I live and where our foundation's headquarters were. And that impacted me in a way that almost no dry statistics could have. And I was involved in setting up a group of foundations to focus on what we could do for the residents of East Jerusalem. I'm very struck. There's a social historian called Lynn Hunt who points out that the rise of human rights, the human rights bodies and principles, happened more or less at the same time as the rise of the novel. And the point that he makes is that the novel, for the first time, enabled people to live the lives of people who were disadvantaged. I can't remember who said it, but that Charles Dickens was far more subversive than Karl Marx was, because he was able to bring home the actual emotional, personal impact. So, yes, I think stories are very powerful indeed.
You give an example in your book about the impact that Talmudic scholar Ruth Calderon had upon the Knesset when she interpreted a Talmudic story that she related to the very sensitive and contemporary topic of ultra-Orthodox serving in the army. Can you explain that experience and why you think her method was so effective? As you write, stories are the most subtle and effective weapons to infiltrate the barricades of logic we build to protect our opinions.
So first of all, I would urge people to go online and watch Ruth Calderon's maiden speech in the Knesset. I don't know if ever anybody has gone up to make their first speech in the Knesset and opened up a Talmud and put it on the dais there and teach a passage brilliantly. And when you watch that clip, and I think it's subtitled now as well, so people can watch it, and understand in English. When you watch it, you need to also watch the face of the ultra-Orthodox Shas chairman of the Knesset, who welcomes her up to the podium with genuine skepticism. What is this? A woman is going to be teaching Talmud and so on and so forth, and is slowly won over by the story, so much so that at one point he actually contributes his own insight. They have a little chavruta between them, and she tells him how brilliant. And it's one of the most beautiful demonstrations. And I think what makes it particularly powerful was not just that Ruth Calderon, in a way that doesn't usually happen in Israeli society, was paying deep respect to the Talmud and teaching how it can be a resource for all of us and for society as a whole. But it was also embedded in a broader story that was very moving, which was her personal story of being a secular Israeli who felt that she had been deprived of this great body of knowledge, by the founders of the state that had sidelined it and so on, and her struggle to try and reclaim it on her own terms. So really, it's one of the most beautiful moments in the Knesset in recent years.
You mentioned how divisive Israeli society was prior to October 7th, and we've only seen globally more division in the past 2 years. What have you learned in that time in terms of difficult conversations, and what lessons can you share that we can apply to, in Rabbi Sacks's words, heal our fractured world?
I think we are actually at the moment at such a critical point, certainly for the future of Israel. As hopefully we are beginning to come out of this terribly dark tunnel, the question is, are we going to revert to those terrible, terrible divisions of before October the 7th? And if we do go back to them, they might go back with even more vitriol based on the pain and the anguish and, accusations based on the last 2 years. Or are we going to somehow find the strength to rise above them? And I think this past 2 years has given us quite a number of lessons in how to do that if only we are receptive to them. When my kids and their friends come out of the army service and come home for Shabbat, you can see a sort of bewilderment in their faces, as they look at what's happening in parts of Israeli society. They would say, what are you guys arguing about? We have spent the past weeks, in some cases months, inside a tank, inside a foxhole, with people who are at the other end of the spectrum, whether it's politically or religiously, all of us having each other's backs. It doesn't make sense that you should be at each other's throats. And I think the question that we have to ask ourselves is, where are the foxholes? Where are the tanks inside Israeli society? And I think they are there. Unfortunately, we don't always get to see them. We don't get to see them in the media. But they really are there in this extraordinary acts of you might call courageous conversations. There was a a teacher in our neighborhood who died, Avi Goldberg, and his wife, Rachel, has 8 children. As a family, they made a decision. They knew that a lot of politicians would want to come and pay tribute in the Shiva tent. And they made an announcement. You guys are all welcome to come on one condition. Come in pairs. A member of the government together with the member of the opposition. And that's what they did. And I think one of the things that is so powerful about the idea of a better conversation, an argument for the sake of heaven, is that it's subversive. Any one of us can do it. We can do it no matter who is in power, no matter what the media says. Any one of us can reach out to somebody else and have a conversation that is honest, is true, is courageous, and hopefully that will bring us a little closer to the truth and to each other.
Thank you, Daniel, for your insight and experience in dealing with such a challenging topic in a truly meaningful way. On behalf of the rest of the judges and the Sacks-Herenstein Center, congratulations again on being awarded the Rabbi Sacks Book Prize.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you for listening. We hope the Sacks Book Prize will catalyze more inspired and inspiring Jewish writing and scholarship.